Fucker! Fucker!
Death is something we've all experienced in the games we play. It's the staple of failure. It's how you're punished for making mistakes. And it's gotten boring. It's not that I'm against dying in a game or punishing the player for screwing up, but too many games handle death the exact same way. Die, go back to a checkpoint, run through what you just did again. So the problem isn't so much that it's there, but rather the way failure is handled takes enjoyment out of the game. It creates redundancy where there was once an original scenario by making you go through the exact events over and over. It's not fun to immediately do what you just did over again. And this is what most games do. And I see a problem here, and it's a problem that only some games attempt to solve. So what I'm asking is, why don't more games try to make death and failure more interesting than do it again? What initially made me think about this was when I played the Prince of Persia reboot a few years back. I didn't get to it when it launched, but I remember hearing a lot of complaints around the time of its release that there was no death system in the game and that made the game too easy. And after playing it, I really don't agree with that criticism. So when you fall to what would normally be your death, you're saved by Elika, and brought back to either the platform you were just at or briefly before then. For the most part, once you do something right, the game doesn't take that away from you. You don't have to achieve the same accomplishment more than once.
I thought I was done for.
Elika will save you in fights too, with the trade-off of the enemy getting a little bit of health back. And I can understand an initial negative reaction to this since it's relatively different from how games normally treat player failure, but I think it's a solid way to keep the game's pacing intact. Instead of creating a sort of illusion of difficulty, Prince of Persia doesn't ask you to repeat a large portion of what's already been done. It's not so much easier as it is the game recognizing what you've proven you're capable of doing already. And that's something I can appreciate. That the game doesn't want to punish you for screwing up without taking away from the actual enjoyment the game's developers worked hard creating. Now this isn't to say that it's bad for a game to punish players for screwing up. I'm fine with the idea of making players pay for their mistakes, but why is it that so many games just opt for repetitiveness? Making sections of gameplay completely redundant isn't a very clever or effective way of designing a game. Think of it like revising an essay you've written. When going in to make corrections, you don't have to write the whole thing word for word again with some adjustments. You take the work you've already done and then fix what you did wrong. So in that sense, the Prince of Persia reboot handles this alright. It's not immensely creative, but it looks nice, doesn't waste your time, and doesn't clog up the narrative by ignoring the main character dying.
Nice catch.
And it's not that repetition can't be utilized to punish players for mistakes either. There are games out there designed around demanding a certain degree of perfection out of the player, like Super Meat Boy. Every time you die, you have to start at the beginning of the level at the slightest mistake. Super Meat Boy even goes as far as celebrating all your deaths after you complete a level. And I think this old-fashioned handling of failure works for a game where the levels are more compartmentalized. Think of platformers like Donkey Kong, Tropical Freeze, Super Meat Boy, games like that. Here you've got a set objective in a smaller area and you're given a determined amount of screw-ups, which can be as low as 1, and told to get from point A to point B without overreaching that mistake quota. These games work fine this way because they're all about mechanical prowess. You have to be at least this good to beat this level. My problem is with games that aren't designed around these smaller mechanics-based levels but utilize the same method of failure. Sure, it's fine for a game to be hard, but there are other ways to challenge players that don't involve repetition. Games just haven't experimented enough with fail states. So I'll start at sort of a strange middle ground between this old-fashioned method of handling failure and a level of exploration with the concept by looking at Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 has somewhat of a traditional death system in that you go back to the last checkpoint or bonfire that you lit, all the basic enemies respawn in their same location, but your character isn't the same. You keep all items you picked up on your previous life, but more importantly, your max health is diminished and all of your souls, the game's currency, have been dropped where you died. This proposes an interesting challenge. Do what you just did and get to the point where you were last killed, but this time, you have less health, and each consequential failed attempt will continue to diminish your max health. The game is forcing you to learn from your mistakes by giving you less resources to complete the task you just failed to do moments ago. And it punishes your mistakes by creating this tension with the idea of losing all your souls, because those souls will go away if you die again before you pick them up. Also, it punishes you by making you increasingly more ugly. So when you die, which you will, many times, you'll have to adapt to this new scenario you're faced with. It is a nice twist on a dated method, but Dark Souls 2 isn't quite the deviation I'm looking for. I like that it adjusts the formula a bit in a way that actually ties into the game's narrative as well, but it still uses the same fundamental idea that I'd like to see games try to move away from. But when I think about a really interesting treatment of failure, my mind jumps to Transistor.
Hey, is that you? Oh, look at you. You're alive. Me, I'm not so sure.
Like many games, Transistor has a standard health bar that gets drained when you're hit by an attack. But if it drains fully, instead of restarting the fight, you'll keep your progress but lose access to one of your 4 abilities. So when you make too many mistakes, you have to finish that current fight and all consequent encounters without one of your abilities. And that ability will stay locked until you reach a certain number of access points. So, like Dark Souls 2, Transistor gives you another chance after you fail, but it challenges you to continue with a handicap. Unlike Dark Souls 2, Transistor doesn't make you do what's already been done before though. Another layer to this is that your ability slot itself isn't locked, but the ability is. So it gives you a chance to also experiment with moves you weren't previously using. So here, failure is used as an opportunity to teach the player about abilities you weren't previously using. Whether it be used as the active ability itself, a passive slot, or an upgrade to another ability, because each function in this game can act as all of those. And Transistor isolates each fight by regenerating your health after you complete an encounter.
Just passing through.
Each battle is treated as its own test of your ability with the game's mechanics. However, if you fail one of them, you'll be challenged to handle upcoming fights with fewer or unfamiliar combat options. While other games repeat the scenario in hopes that you learn from your mistakes, Transistor makes you live with your mistakes and forces you to immediately adjust how you play your game. You're not seeing the same thing again, your time isn't wasted. Instead, you're challenged to continue and deal with the consequences of your mistake, and overcoming that challenge feels great. But you do get sent to the last checkpoint you're at if you run out of all your functions in a single fight, but it's pretty hard to get to that point. So Transistor doesn't halt the progression of the game when you make a mistake, but it also doesn't ignore that you made one either. You remember your screw-ups because you have to live with those consequences instead of just trying to correct them in another playthrough. But this process also gives you the chance to learn other ways to handle combat encounters with different moves.
I guess we're done here.
And I think that fail states deserve and need to be explored further because they can seriously hurt a game's experience.
What was that?
There's a lot of time spent building atmosphere in Alien Isolation. Thuds from ceiling vents, unknown blips on your motion detector, and sometimes just silence. And this atmosphere is incredibly tense when you first experience it, and then something like this will happen.
Marshal Waits. This is Chief Porter and tech support. Look, there's nothing on this flight recorder, Waits. We've broken God knows how many courses.
You return to the last save station you visited, and at this point all the tension transforms into frustration. Frustration of seeing and hearing what I just went through again, frustration of the game's numerous efforts to make me scared, now feeling wasted. And I get that using that unforgiving save system adds to that tension I mentioned earlier. Even the act of saving is tense because you have to make yourself vulnerable for 3 seconds while doing it. And it's effective at building the atmosphere until that point where you die. The threat of death can be a great tool to use in a horror game, but now when the result of that threat leads to repetition, things just aren't as scary the second time around. And that fear of losing makes hearing those faint beeping tones of the save systems relieving. But that doesn't stop the experience as a whole being hurt by the game's monotonous punishment system. And I don't mean for this to sound like an easy thing to fix, especially handling horror games. I'd say PT does it well, but it benefits from being such a small environment and is designed around repetition. But I've talked about this in another video, so check that one out if you want to. But what I see from games that do try to build tension, they'll utilize the same death mechanic of just sending the player back to the last checkpoint, but not before a special send-off. Rather than try creating a different result from failing, games like The Last of Us and Resident Evil put a spotlight on the death itself. And it's obvious why games use this. It's because you don't want to die. Dying's obviously not supposed to be fun, and it is a solid encouragement to perform well, but it's also pretty obvious that people don't enjoy failing. So why don't games try to make something more of failure than just failure? Games put a lot of emphasis on success, but failure often gets ignored. I'm not saying failing should be satisfying, but you can do something interesting with it, like creating relationships between the player and game characters, like in Far Cry 2.
You alright? Okay.
Losing all your health in Far Cry 2 can often result in one of your buddies coming to rescue you. And seeing this person drag you from a vulnerable camera angle and carrying you off from this firefight really helps establish a trust between you and whichever one of your buddies came to save you. And one of the reasons I think it's so effective is because it's just unexpected. You'll be on your own for the majority of these fights until the point where you possibly fail and collapse. One of your buddies will come seemingly out of nowhere to help you. It also benefits from just being so against game expectations. Most of the time campaigns are a solo affair with no one to count on but yourself. You succeed on your own, fail on your own, but Far Cry 2 lets you fall back on non-player characters in the campaign. It's a really interesting feeling of being able to count on someone other than yourself, let alone an AI partner. It also gives you incentive to interact with these characters whenever you can so that they're willing to save you.
I'm gonna ambush these punches and wreck everything. Let's do it together.
And it works so well at establishing a connection to an AI character because it's entirely through the gameplay itself. It's an event that occurs entirely based on what you, the player, do in that scenario, which, in this case, is fail.
Stay low, there's a sniper out there. See you around. Hey dude, you're fucked up. Stick something on that.
And to a degree, this is what the Prince of Persia reboot attempts to do, try to establish a bond between the player and Elika. Unfortunately, it doesn't work well here, mainly because Elika gets objectified to feel more like a tool than a character. Her other actions in the game, like helping you with larger jumps and fighting, are all instructed by you. So despite the narrative's efforts to make her feel like a strong character, the game itself treats her as an instrument. Whereas Far Cry 2's characters feel like they have their own motivations for helping you, and in that sense feel more like characters. And there's no right way to handle failure, it's just that there's a definite absence of deviation from what's been done so many times already. Frankly, I don't think we should be modeling most of our fail states after Groundhog Day. As I said before, games focus a lot on win conditions and succeeding, but often neglect any sort of exploration with failure. And that's what I want to see change. It's a big part of games that just hasn't been exposed to enough creativity yet. Even Transistor, the game I highlighted as having a creative handling of failure, falls back on this old method in extreme cases. We know what it looks and feels like to be held to the standards that success usually demands. But maybe we'll find something interesting after we fall down a few times.
It's